I wanted to start with the first question that we had sent you, but that the, mostly starting back at the beginning of your time
Yeah, yeah.
improvising, and just asking about how you started, if it started during your undergrad, if it started before, and if you worked with student composers at Northwestern and the San Francisco Conservatory, because in terms of performance, like I went
Yeah.
to Northwestern for my undergrad also, and I worked at the conservatory in San Francisco actually for one
Oh, no
year,
shit. Okay.
so I'm somewhat familiar with
Yeah.
that school culture
You
as
know the
well.
vibe.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering if you found space to experiment, improvise at that time, or was it later?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that I found space in the sense of like people that I was around, like particularly as you know from Northwestern, like the doctoral composition students like teach theory. So they were all my theory teachers. And I was around when like, I mean, I had like Ken Kumpf, Dave Reminick, Katie Young, like that kind of generation of folks around. So like I was exposed to a lot of that music. Um, I it was not really, I didn't really have any like compatriots. um, that's a strange word now that I say it. But like I didn't have any people that I was necessarily playing with like at Northwestern. I was mostly just kind of, I didn't know any, basically going into college, I didn't know anything about any kind of music since like Ravel or Debussy. For those of y'all that are listening, I come from like a very classical background. But there were things in high school. Both my parents are artists. I was like super interested in visual art and like contemporary art and things like that. I always thought that was like one of the more like punk things that I could do when I was 15 and living in the middle of nowhere in South Carolina was to get really into contemporary art. Um, but yeah, and through that, like got to know some like Cage, Feldman era stuff, but really didn't start until I went to college. And then I had theory teachers and things like that, people like that that I was exposed to. Um, with regards to improvisation in general, I had a lot of hangups for a long time because through some of these people, like and I feel really deeply lucky for this, is that I had a kind of reverence for improvisation and for free improvisation in particular. Um, of like, I think my like 17 or 18-year-old self understood the skill and the special type of music, like the special type of like musicianship and relationship with your instrument, relationship with playing with other people. And I really didn't feel like I could do it. And so I didn't. Um, and there were some people that I played with, um, some of which went on to like start the group Mockrep. They were at DePaul around the same time. I remember I would go down and we would like play in the basement of like, we would like improvise together in the basement of like DePaul's cathedral, or their church, which is now their concert hall. But it really wasn't until, yeah, later on that I was actually felt comfortable doing it myself. I actually started improvising on piano rather than trombone, just because that was my first instrument. But yeah, it was kind of through all those. I would go to like the shows at Elastic back when it used to be above the Chinese restaurant um, in Logan Square, I think. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Well,
But
there's no correct answer, but
yeah, that's fair.
I was like, I guess I was. So, how did that develop? You said that you had a reverence for improvising at such a young age, even before you started college. Like, do you know where that came from? Because that's pretty. I feel like that's pretty uncommon.
Yeah, I had again some of these people like show me um, a lot of kind of older like free improvisation records, more in retrospect, more from a kind of white Eurocentric perspective, less so of kind of like the black radical tradition. I got to know some work of like Roscoe Mitchell, Anthony Braxton early on, but definitely gravitated towards, at least as a brass player, the kind of like Peter Evans, Nate Woolley type of thing. Um, it was something that I'd always kind of wanted, and I tried to bring into working with composers, was this like kind of exploratory mindset um, of working with an instrument. And I could see that like these like that people that practiced improvisation in this way had this kind of immediacy with their materials. And I had seen like playing a trombone, it wasn't like I had all of this like like catalog of great repertoire to play. Um, and so I kind of saw that as like a niche that I then followed, was to kind of make a lot of like commission repertoire and work with composers on this. But I was always kind of listening to like improvised music records and like really trying to engage in that in such a way. But I never felt like I could like, I knew like once I started to try to figure out reverse engineer how like they made these sounds, and I was like, well, then to make your own music with that was like felt, I don't know, sorry, um, felt out of reach in a way, because it was like that. I think I grasped how difficult it was. um, and yeah.
So do you remember some of your first moments improvising then, and like how what that path was like?
Yeah. I mean, I remember like doing it. It was a very like private thing of like using it to kind of explore the instrument, and usually by myself, um, just to like see what I would come up with. I was always pretty bashful about it. So, but people in the like in other practice rooms would hear me, um, and they would ask me questions later. But um, yeah, and then just kind of more and more, it was always kind of, I don't know, just trying to think back, just funneled into compositional stuff until I realized that that was not totally what I wanted to do. That I was actually really what I've really been after is that kind of immediacy with the instrument, and the kind of flexibility with which you can just kind of um, move in that way. Sorry, I feel a bit scatterbrained right now. I've been on Zoom for a while.
Is your background entirely in band and orchestral, classical,
Drum
concert
corps,
music? Drum corps.
drum and bugle corps. Um, yeah, so I started. It was in classical, like I took like piano lessons as a kid, and then the only outlet that I really had was like marching band and drum corps in high school, and then started to then take lessons from like a local band teacher, all like the kind of like concert band, wind band type stuff. Played in a community band, played in the community jazz band growing up, and then started to take lessons with one of the people in the Atlanta Symphony in high school. So then that's when the kind of like move towards classical music happened. But now seeing what my life is like nowadays, like the classical music thing was kind of like was the detour. I was worried that the experimentalism stuff was the detour away from classical music, but now that I've had enough time away, it's actually feels like the classical music was the detour. Yeah. So it's always kind of been this like kind of weird middle space between things.
Did you
Um,
spend much time playing or improvising in the jazz world?
I played in a lot of big bands in high school. I was never super comfortable. I could never wrap my brain, and I still honestly can't wrap my brain around like the concept of playing over changes. Like somehow, like I don't work, and in a lot of my music now, especially, like I don't feel like I think melodically or like think kind of linearly in that way. Um, I love to listen to that music a lot, but my own thoughts like kind of start to fall apart if I start to try to string them together into a straight line. Um, and so yeah, I've veered away from that. Just and then yeah, starting to get back into like usually like kind of happened in grad school of like getting interested in, yeah, texture and timbre and things like that. Then coming back around to improvisation made a lot of sense, and I found this way of kind of living in that space while not having to think in that way, because I just wasn't good at it.
Can you talk maybe a little bit now about your instrument building process? I mean, you
Yeah,
have you know played the trombone. You studied the trombone in high school, but you've also expanded into euphonium, baritone, trumpet,
yeah,
bass trumpet, these things, and you've spent significant amount of time modifying them.
yeah,
So where was the, and also I should say, even with Ensemble Pamplemousse, you spent a lot
yeah,
of time playing things that are
yeah,
not even conventional instruments,
yeah.
right? Or
I'm learning
just
to play the
performative
banjo
things.
right now.
I love that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, totally. I mean, it started kind of coming out of like the a lot of the histories of like instrumental like preparation type stuff in like Eurocentric avant-garde music, at least as I knew it. Um, and then it just I got really and I'm still really interested in just how sound works and how instruments work, just in terms of like a material basis. And so then yeah, it just started to kind of question like, okay, like if this is how a trombone makes sound, like what are all the different component parts? Um, how does how do these things work in like analogs to other things? So a lot of the stuff like with my solo record is like me trying to take like the aspects of like a synthesizer or like modular music or modular coding and reapply that back onto an instrument. So instead of like valves, it's actually kind of like a 3-channel crossfader or something like that. And so approaching like building instruments in that way, I'm not as good with my hands, and so I'm never like making. I wish I could make a brass instrument, um, but it's more kind of thinking about building instruments in a like electroacoustic, like cyborgy like Donna Haraway sense of like these things that are like weird concatenations of like acoustic and electronic and microphones and like some trash I found on the street, um, and like a cello bow and all these kind of things. And yeah, just coming from like definitely like a trial and error type thing of like being really interested in like how do these kind of systems work. Um, yeah, lately with the instrument building, it's been interesting to kind of play with the like the histories of the instruments themselves too. So not just like, oh, what kind of sounds can I get out of like an electromechanical banjo or a trombone, but like what are the contexts in which we see these instruments? What are the things that we expect out of them? What are the repertoire? Who plays them? Who doesn't? Who plays them? Who doesn't play them? Et cetera, et cetera. And like, what do we do with that? In a way. But yeah, as far as like improvisation with instrument building, I it's definitely kind of I want to be surprised by things. I've always really liked the story, and kind of the progression of how David Tudor moved from piano to electronics, of like getting so proficient at something. And I'm not saying that I'm proficient at the trumpet, but it's gotten to a point with brass instruments where I 9 times out of 10 know what's going to come out if I put whatever I put into it. Um, and yeah, I'm interested in systems where that's a little less linear, where there's like elements of surprise. There's like, oh, I didn't know that like I could push this patch into this particular place, or I didn't know that like this kind of sound could come out of this like weird instrumental combination, in a way that like Tudor got really interested in like feedback systems and like nonlinear, like electrical feedback and things like that. And so like it's more kind of the improvisation is less like I'm spinning out this story and more like I'm kind of shepherding this like group of things around and kind of like I know somewhat of where the boundaries of the system are, and I kind of know that like if I do this, like these other kinds of things will generally happen, but like wanting to build in or like preserve some level of like surprise or risk or like kind of contingency, um, and things like that. So yeah, like preparations and things to brass instruments that make them less linear. I always tend and I always tend to kind of gravitate towards.
Is that sort of, do you feel like that's a way of expanding also your continued development as an improviser because
Totally.
you're on the edge of not knowing what's about to
Yeah,
happen?
totally. Um, yeah, because it's a level of like you kind of get to learn alongside of it in a way. I always like to build that into like some of the pieces, like again, like on the solo record, where it's like there were some sounds where they sound not only do they sound different, but they behave in completely different ways, whether I've been playing it for 1 minute versus 5 minutes versus 10 minutes, and trying to find those ways in which like sounds break down, or they can kind of like turn into other things depending on how long or like in what ways you combine them. Yeah.
So that might take us to sort of a good segue into talking about
Yeah.
the solo album a little
Yeah.
bit more, particularly about this process you talked about with trial and error, which was an interview I read that you
Yeah.
said that was the process used was trial and error, but particularly in terms of improvisation, the role of
Yeah.
improvisation in creating the pieces. If you can talk about
Totally.
that.
Yeah. It was the thing with those where a lot of these sounds that are like either very nonlinear or very chaotic, and chaotic in the sense of like chaotic behavior, rather than like chaotic energy. I tend to like very like specific, like bounded energy, but the kind of behaviors are a little less um, A to B. That to try to compose that felt like it was missing the point altogether. And there's a certain level of like micro detail of like timbre and timing and pacing and just general feel that was like I can't like that to like try to compose this in a predetermined way feels like really counterintuitive to the very things that I'm interested in about these sounds. And so it was trying to find ways of like what makes them composed, or what makes them like unique, or what are the material or sculptural qualities that make these things, and then like what are the kind of zones of like unpredictability or discovery that I can kind of highlight. So a lot of them, yeah, there's um, I'm they are composed in the sense they have like very, very particular setups and forms and materials, and um, forms just meaning like trajectories and things like that. But a lot of the materials like just have to be kind of massaged on the spot. Um, and so I wanted to highlight that. And as far as like the trial and error stuff goes, I probably played these at like 1 or 2 dozen gigs before I recorded them. And it was a thing like, I remember especially like the fourth track, the euphonium track. Um, I did that one at least 5 or 6 different ways, with like a bunch of different types of mutes. I remember the first time that I did it, it was like I had about like 30 or 40 feet of plastic tubing in between all of the valve slides. That got scrapped. Things like that. Like different mutes, different materials, like, oh, like this buzzing of this particular pie tin versus like this buzzing of this particular glass sheet, things like that. That you don't really know until you like get in front of a group of people and actually do it. Because it's, I don't know, I'm not good at like conceiving of things in my head beforehand. It's always like you kind of need to like do it, or like, which is why I was drawn to electronics, is that you could then hear it kind of in real time and make decisions. And a lot of that filters into improvisation a lot as well, where, yeah, you're having to respond to people in real time. And like um, yeah, like that's like such a gift in a way. Um, and that's why, like, at least with the solo stuff, I'm always talking about like composition or sculpture or like fixed things, because I don't know. Improvisation is such a big thing, and like I tend to want to compose stuff if it's solo. Um, yeah,
All the devices that you've built for that solo album, have you spent
yeah.
any time improvising with other people with those devices, and how has that changed your conception of how it works, or if it
Yeah.
works in a particular setting?
I mean, at least for that one, like the solo brass record is just more like pretty much all just acoustic sounds. At least some of the other things, like I built kind of a synth setup that I've improvised with a lot. That one has just constantly changed over time. That was like I was getting super, like maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. Took a deep dive into like modular synth world. I was already doing coding and Max, things like that, and then obviously super inspired by people like Sam Pluta, Richard Titelbaum, or things like that, and wanted to try my hand at it. um, Rodrigo Constanzo is another one who I'm like still constantly learning from. But yeah, and those have just like taken so many forms over time and with different people and like thinking of things, and that kind of really got my brain around this thing about thinking about instruments and thinking about music in general in this really like modular way, where it's not like a kind of unified thing, but it's all these parts that like like stumbling over myself. Yeah, like all these parts that kind of work together in this interdependent system where it's like my lungs and my instrument and like the thing that's on the instrument and like the microphone and the effects chain and all of these things are all these different parts in which they can either work together or they can totally not work together at all, and everything in between. Yeah, some of the newer stuff, like the aforementioned banjos, I want to do with groups and stuff and people. I have this like dream to do like I just have like a noise bluegrass band, um, maybe like in the post-COVID world. Um, but yeah,
What are you doing with banjos right now?
it's basically kind of a conceptual record that's all around like concepts of like old time music. Um, Obviously goes in with like the southernness, but like really have gotten really interested in in like folk traditions, like vernacular traditions, what these kind of like how these things um, start to um, start to kind of like poke at and destabilize like a lot of like rural urban divides or like modernism, like modern avant-garde and old time, like all of these things, like they start to get really confusing and really interesting in these states. And so it's been a way of kind of how do I work with these? So it's like one side is all this stuff for like the electromechanically controlled banjos and antique radios. That's all focused around like bluegrass and country music. And then actually behind me is two 120-year-old pump organs that were actually made a half a mile from my house that I currently live in. The entire town of Brattleboro would not exist without one particular organ company. And then
Wait. Go back to the clocks. I'm curious how you're using a clock.
A clock.
And didn't you say a clock? Is that what I heard?
Radios.
Radios, excuse me. So
Yeah.
how are you using a radio? And
I turned the frame, like the metal frame and the truss rod of a banjo into an AM radio antenna. So you can have your sound through it, because at least in like that's how most of that instrument found its way outside of the regional culture in the South, was through the radio. And so to kind of invert that and have like all of these sounds be able to be projected through the instrument itself and out kind of into these radios that would have been contemporaneous with it. Yeah.
so you have multiple banjos that you're
Yeah.
preparing?
Yeah. Which has been fun. That was my like summer project of like how am I gonna like deal with this.
Did people donate banjos to you? Like,
No,
how does that work?
I bought one. I found one at a Goodwill, and then my partner's dad let me borrow his. But
So you're not modifying that one a ton, are you?
it can all clamp on and off.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are some of the other preparations that you've done to it besides the
Oh,
radio?
solenoid motors all over the thing. Basically built, DIY'd some EBOs. So every string has like an EBO on it. There's transducers and contact mics on the inside of every head, so it can be both a receiver and like it can transmit and receive sound, stuff like that. I have no idea what I'm doing with it all yet, but it's been fun making it. But also like with like going back to like improvisation, like that goes all into it, of like that things are contingent upon like the materials that you have and like the things that you're interested in and like the kind of um, yeah, like the tools that you're using, and trying to test stuff out and like, does this work and like, does this not work? And I'll often like, yeah, just play with these things for a long time to kind of start to figure out like what do I really find meaningful in this versus like what's kind of maybe superfluous, like outside the project.
So you talked about this a little bit, being from the South, and you're using these
Yeah.
banjos. In your bio, you talk about your work and your performance, improvisation, and composition as being sort of anchored around the identity and cultural histories of rural spaces.
Yeah.
Um, I also think about this a lot because I am from the South as well,
Yeah.
but I'm also living in the mountains
You
here
live
and
in there.
teaching in
Yeah.
Appalachia. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about this and how you're thinking of it and how it informs your work and like what you think about making contemporary art or noise music even in
Yeah.
rural spaces?
Yeah. I mean, it's a thing that I feel like I'm finally coming around to, like having grown up there, is that there's the kind of, at least for me, like growing up in a really rural place, like there's an anxiety around like the fact that the world seemed to exist everywhere but here. Um, and that was a big thing that I carried and I still carry. And then starting to kind of just try to turn that back on itself. And be like, okay, well, like, what is really here? Why am I trying to run away from this? Like, I grew up for 17 years in South Carolina and then moved from city to city to city for the last 10 years, until now. Um, and so it's kind of looking at that and trying to see what's there, and like an attunement to place, and especially time within places. And sorry, I'm totally losing my train of thought. I haven't like talked about, work has been for like, I mean, for probably for all of us during the pandemic, but like creative work has been such a like weird like conceptual thing for the drawer during all of this. So like my brain doesn't know how to organize anything into words. Um, but yeah, it's trying to find and highlight what's really there. Um, Various things about it. It's like the town that I'm from is actually where both of the people who um, edited and collated the entire like Sacred Heart tradition like lived and died in my hometown. I knew none of this growing up. Things like that. Um, and just trying to like connect it to the outside world, because there's a lot of stuff with the South of like, I don't know. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. It's the stuff that I think about a lot, but I'm not able to. I'm really not able to put it into words,
I mean,
at this moment. I'm sorry.
one of the things for me is that I think I always felt like, you know, New York was the place where things were happening, and if you could just get there, then
Yeah,
everything would be better, and you'd be in that world. But somehow
yeah,
that mentality seems like it doesn't actually help the people who can't leave the South or don't
right,
have the means to leave,
right,
and
right,
are maybe is harmful to the people who are actively trying to make that space
right.
better and more interesting.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, because I mean, it's a thing where it's like I'm interested in like complicating a lot of the complicating, or like honestly doing away with a lot of the binaries in all these cultures of like, you have like a certain expectation you have out of rural space versus a certain expectation you have out of urban space, political, racial, gender, sexuality, all these like kind of expectations about where and when these things exist. Um, and history just doesn't work like that. I've lately been doing a bunch of reading about like all the textile strikes in like in like the 1930s in the South, and like all of there's a really amazing book that I just started by like Robin D.G. Kelly about like the whole rise of like the Communist Party in Alabama during the Great Depression, primarily like black-led communists living and like just all these things where like history just doesn't work in the ways like doesn't work like that. Especially like yeah, when we're talking about like New York or like things like or like in these kind of relationships, there's a lot that has to do with class in there. And I think that's a huge difference and a thing that like it's just really complex, and I'm really interested in that complexity and yeah.
What do you think that your Appalachian community would think of you
Oh,
turning
I
the
have no
banjo on
idea.
its head or making a noise bluegrass album or something
Yeah.
like this?
Well, it's been really interesting because with the other side of it, with like the organs, like it's basically like that project is turning into basically this kind of sonic archive of Vermont, and a part of that has been basically going into a lot of like actual spaces, whether they're like churches or old train stations or things like that, and actually measuring the like impulse, like basically taking impulse responses of all these spaces. But interesting part of that has been the consent. I have to get in touch with people. I have to interface with people and naturally have to kind of like do this, like talk to them and get to know them. And surprisingly, more and more like this type of work where it's like, oh yeah, like it might be super experimental, but it's kind of rooted in these things, whether it's a particular instrument or a particular place or a particular group of people. People are really open, like way more so than like, oh yeah, I'm doing all this like weird stuff on a trombone. It's like, I don't know, it's I've just found it to be like, can I come and like run a bunch of sine waves through your old like train station has led to, I don't know, at least for me, a lot more interest than like, hey, look at my like noise record. um I don't know, it's about finding other points of access into these things, and trying to think about my own like instrumental practice and my own like improvisational language in ways that expand ways of meaning instead of close it down.
How long have you been in Vermont now?
Uh, how long has this pandemic been going? It's 9 months.
I got you. Was this a,
Yeah,
a, a pandemic related move or a partner related
yeah.
move?
My lease was up in New York City. I was feeling really burned out there, um, and the thought of moving within New York in April um, terrified me. So I chose to. I had a couple of friends up here, but I also just chose to kind of take the plunge.
And how has that community been?
It's good. I don't see a lot of people, but pretty much everyone's really nice. I have a studio for the first time in my life, which is really awesome. Um, and yeah, generally people are up here. I love Vermont. I gotta say, like I will put a shameless plug out there um, for it. Um, it's been nice just to kind of like during all of this like crazy chaotic um, just time of both like of just this time of reckoning with a lot of our like past lives, whether like individual or societal or et cetera, et cetera. It's been I needed I needed to like take a step back, and I'm grateful that I've had a little bit of mental space right now and physical space to do so. Um, yeah, there's like I said, like art is now more a self-regulatory thing that I do to like make me feel good than to like exist in a kind of public sphere, which is I think a really important aspect of it that that I don't know, we definitely meaning me, always kind of shoved to the side. Um, that it's something that we fundamentally do for ourselves, and we do it to exist with other people. But it helps. I don't know, it helps me feel more like me, and that's as good of a reason to do it.
I
Um,
I would imagine that living in New York City, it's pretty easy to lose sight of that because
yeah,
of the hustle of everything, which is true for every city, but
totally.
even like I'm in Cleveland, there's a much smaller scene for pretty
Right.
much everything here, but
Yeah.
it definitely makes me feel more part of a community and like
Right.
get a sense that this is a very specific place and has a
Right.
specific history.
Right.
Not that New York doesn't have that, but I think it can easily get lost in this whirlwind of such international, like being an international hub and being
Totally.
so very urban.
Yep.
The epitome of urban.
Well, and the interesting thing about New York is that, and you see it both in the music scene and kind of more fascinatingly in the city itself, of like it's that way because there are so many intersecting and overlapping histories and cities that are on top of one another. There's actually I just finished um, N.K. Jemisin's new book, The City That We Became, and she does all of this like with all of the boroughs, but all of these like different timelines and like parallel like multiverse things with New York City. And it's really beautiful. But it's this thing where it's like it feels so overwhelming, and on the one hand it is this international hub, and on the other it's like has all of these like its own histories, but they're all just like it is like 7 cities that are like stacked on top of one another. Um, and that is really, yeah, exhausting to navigate, um, and definitely kind of goes into the music scene as well. You have like so many people coming from so many different lineages that it's both like amazing and overwhelming on one hand, and pretty easy to like lose sight of like, I don't know, your own identity and your own like relationship to it on another.
Have you been playing a lot of trombone lately?
Hardly any. A friend down in Greenfield and I have been playing together, doing the like every other week, get like, or maybe not every other week, but we've done it a couple times of like do the like rapid COVID test and then play together. But yeah, mostly other than that, very little apart from like some recording stuff online. I don't know. I've just been reading a lot of books and like going out in the woods all the time, which is great.
Yeah, this seems like it. I don't know when, you talk about how your sort of your musical or your approach to music making shifted somewhat recently. Was this a somewhat serendipitous occasion that like the pandemic happened, your lease was up, and it made sense for you to move to a smaller town away from whatever the urban areas?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I definitely the move away was like very just was like the decision making at that point was very like, okay, I need to do the smartest thing for right now, and then like not worry about anything else after it. So I think it's probably going to take me a long time to unpack all of this.
I'm just giving
um,
it meaning it
no,
probably doesn't
totally.
even have, so that's fine.
Yeah, no. I know. I'm laughing at like what that's actually going to feel like to actually have to come to terms with that. No, I mean the I would say like, yeah, maybe in the thing that I wrote, like I had put it in past tense. The shifted is definitely like very much in the present tense. Um, it's a general just kind of like, yeah, which I'm sure a lot of people and probably all of us are going through in our own ways right now, but just a reflection on what we have done and what we want to do, both as artists, but also just as people. And so a lot of the shift has just been like, yeah, like how, like, what do we do now? And so at least for me, it's a lot of questioning, like why experimentalism? What are the kinds of listening modes? What are the kinds of like economies that like a type of experimentalism promote? What kinds of like hierarchies, whether they're um, in any way, sorry, um, like what are the things that are present both in like the structures that we're having to work within, but also like within ourselves. Yeah, I don't have any answers. I feel like pretty deep in the like, what are we doing? But
So has
yeah,
improvising also been shifting? Like, are you conscious of that happening? Is it happening?
yeah, it very much so. I feel really, in all honesty, very distant from it right now, because at least for me, improvisation is such a social thing. Like I see it like very much in kind of social terms. I could even see it in terms of like partnering and things like that, and like how do you work with different people, all of these type of things. And so actually, like it's never really, which is maybe why I'm having such a difficult time talking about it. It's never really been that much of a solo practice for me. Um, I don't find it as much where my brain goes. I think it is, yeah, at least for me, like improvisation is it's extremely social. It's how do you relate to other people? It's how do you kind of engage with other people or engage with your surroundings? The thing that I've always loved about it is that it's both like an expression of self, but it's also this like total feedback loop on the sense of like structure and material and person and like who we are as people, and like where every single way in which we make things can be um, affected by everything else that happens. And I find it, at least in this point in my life, to be really difficult to kind of self-engage in that way. And the times that I have gotten to play with other people outside during this, it's been super refreshing and really wonderful, and like stretching these muscles that I haven't used in a while. Um, but at least as far as like those kinds of methods, I mean, I've been getting super interested in like archival materials and like information as archive, and like instrumental practice, like your own practice as its own kind of archive. Your like listening habits is their own kind of like archive, meaning just like lots of collections of stuff that you then have to kind of sort through. And so like, what does it mean then to like bring these like aspects of improvisation, of like listening and like highly tuned awareness to things, to something that is inherently large and overwhelming, and like a thing that you kind of have to navigate. So I've been thinking a lot about that, trying to build archives that you can improvise through. Actually working on a saxophone piece that does exactly that right now, where I recorded an hour's worth of solo, like basically found through going back to like the 30s, like found all of these records of solo tenor saxophone on record, usually by the band leader, and then compiled them into a buffer using like this procedure called concatenative synthesis. You can basically then match any input grain to something else in a pre-recorded buffer, and so you can essentially improvise with like the recorded archive of the tenor saxophone, which has been very fun to like put like classic Sonny Rollins records into. But yeah, things like that. Like how do we navigate our histories? How do we navigate our futures? Or like what's included in this, what's not included in this, things like that.
What are some things you've been collecting lately?
Slate tiles. They're used as roofing material up here. I've turned them into a bunch of, you can kind of see them over there.
But what are you turning them
Like
into?
plate reverb. You can basically then run impulse responses and then just, yeah, it's their own like DIY reverb. What else? Been making that's been like the one recently, of like going around like abandoned buildings and stuff and trying to find all the roofing tiles. Yeah, collecting then also like recorded examples of the tenor saxophone from 1939 to 2020.
There's one question left that I very specifically want to ask, and that's
Yeah,
the question
totally.
about porousness.
Yep.
If you can talk about what that is in music for you, and then if it's something that you consciously think about when you improvise, or maybe you haven't had a chance to do that. But
Yeah. No, I think it's really important is that it's not coming into something with a kind of fixed idea of what you wanted. It's like being flexible to your environment, whether that's as a player, as like a producer, like often a lot of times like in my work, former work as a sound engineer, like you're really having to work with what you have, like a kind of DIY attitude. And then also as instrumental, it's just like being open to, it works on a lot of different levels of like both like materially, like being open to change, being open to like being influenced by other people, being open to like working with your surroundings. I think the way in which excuse me, at least when I wrote that, I was thinking about it was that music or your practice or a language can change depending on where it is presented. Um, but it also, yeah, it also definitely extends out to like your listening habits and like just allowing oneself to be changed, um, and like kind of um, yeah. There's a really another book that I was reading recently. Parable of the Talent. Parable. I can't remember what it's first. It's Parable of the Sower is the first one. The Octavia Butler novel from the '90s. It's all about this character who invents her own religion, where it's basically that they worship change, so that like change and like in the universe is like the fundamental attribute of everything. And so it's this whole like credo that like God is change and change is God, which is like super pantheistic, in this way. But it's this thing of like allowing change to happen, allowing influence to happen, allowing pieces to breathe in a way, allowing like my language to and our languages to breathe, because we're all different people. Like we all, I don't know, I believe in like we have a bunch of different selves inside of us, and they lead or don't, or they lead or recede depending on who we're around. And I wanted, I don't know, a kind of art making to do that as well. If that makes any I feel really scattered. I'm sorry.
It's perfect.
I like took a bunch of notes, and I feel like I'm just being a total scatterbrain right now.
Well, you're improvising, I hope.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I hope we get a chance to improvise
Oh
together
God.
again soon.
One day.
After this, one day.
Yeah. How are y'all holding up through everything?